Hi there, welcome to this revision podcast on globalization and the UK economy. Now, what I'm going to try and do is cover the whole of globalization in 3 minutes. Actually, I'm not going to try and do that. I'm just trying to give you a snapshot of some of the key issues over the next kind of 15, 20 minutes so that you have a good base from which to attack the rest of the revision on globalization. Let's start off with a simple question. What is globalization? I'm sure you'll have a nice definition somewhere in your notes. There's lots of different ways of interpreting the idea. The most important thing, I think, is that globalization is a process. It's not an event. It's a process in which national economies have becoming, over time, increasingly integrated and interdependent with each other. There's many ways of defining globalization, but I think those two key words, integration and interdependence, are really quite important. Okay. The other aspect, the other question, I suppose, is globalization something that's always going to be with us? Is it an inevitable process? And the answer to that, I think, is no. This chart is really quite interesting. It shows the path, the index of global trade in goods and services. And it's kind of used as a kind of litmus test or benchmark or indicator of globalization. Follow the chart from 2002 upwards. Then we got 2001, we had 9/11, and we had a sort of mini recession in the world economy. So global trade took a bit of a dip. But then from 2002 onwards, we saw this steady, sustained, significant increase in the value of world trade in goods and services. This was an era of globalization. It's not the first one, but certainly an important period. But then we hit the global financial crisis, 2007, 2008 into 2009, and many countries going into recession. Look what happened to the value of world trade. It fell very sharply. It took us back almost 10 years to where we were before. Obviously, it recovered in 2010 and 2011 and what have you. But notice the gradient of the red dotted line. That is the trend growth of world trade from 2011 to 2014. It's much flatter than the previous trend. So I think we can say that globalization is not inevitable, that trade normally increases most years. We seem to be in a phase where world trade, the global exchange of goods and services, that's growing slightly less quickly than it was the previous decade. And that gives you an idea of the impact of the shock of the world financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Also, I think what this chart also demonstrates is that instead of globalization of trade, I mean true globalization, perhaps we're moving into an era of regionalization, where increasingly you get intra-regional trade becoming a dominant force in the world economy. What are some of the key features or characteristics of globalization? This slide tries, I think, to capture half a dozen of these key characteristics of a globalized economy. First point, and I'm going to go across the top row to start with. First point is that for most, not all countries, but for most countries, the ratio of trade to GDP is rising. In other words, if we look at the value of imports and exports, add them together and divide by GDP, that number is getting higher. And that's a sign that countries are becoming more integrated into the world economy. Globalization is not just about trade, however. We're also seeing significant expansion of financial flows between countries, money moving from banks to banks, money moving from investors into stock markets, and from commodity investors into bonds, what have you. And there's a huge expansion of financial capital flows across national borders. And then linked to that is the volatile but trend rise in the value of foreign direct investment in the world economy, so-called FDI, and also big, often huge cross-border mergers and acquisitions, the world of takeovers, and increasingly the idea there that emerging market countries have the financial resources to make some pretty hefty acquisitions of companies from the rich advanced nations. And then across the bottom, three more characteristics of globalization. This is something which, at the bottom left, something that we truly understand as consumers, that we're seeing the rise of truly global brands, including many from emerging economies. And whilst we're all aware of Amazon and Google and Coca-Cola. Now, what about companies such as Alibaba, okay, from China, already one of the world's biggest retailers? Globalization is also leading to a much deeper specialization of labor. So your typical iPhone will have component parts where they've come from many, many different countries, each of which is specializing in a particular aspect, either the hardware or the software involved in its production. And we're also starting to see the importance of global supply chains, logistics chains around the world, helped by the process of containerization, where the global sourcing has become a phenomenon. Firms can scour the world to find the cheapest raw materials, the cheapest component parts, the cheapest bits of technology, and ultimately, of course, the lowest unit labor costs. Transport costs have fallen, logistic costs have fallen, and therefore supply chains have become ever more important. Also seeing, as part of globalization, the emergence of new trade and investment routes. My instinct in this presentation tonight is that this is perhaps one of the most important dynamics in the whole globalization process. Have a look at this chart. This chart basically maps trade networks in 1995. And at the heart of those trade networks 20 years ago was the United States, was Japan, was Germany, and to a lesser extent, the UK, Italy, and Netherlands. The size of the blobs tell you the significance of the trade. Obviously, the lines between them show the networks. Well, that was 1995. If we now fast forward to 2013, the game has changed. Let me show those two networks one more time. 1995, 2013. The rise of China, South Korea, Singapore, India, the UAE, Thailand, Malaysia, Taiwan, Indonesia. The world network of trade relationships has become significantly bigger. This is what I mean by an interconnected world. And the center of gravity is moving, it's moving southeast. It's probably somewhere in a subway restaurant just south of Istanbul. One of the big stories at the moment, I do urge you to have a look at this as part of your revision, is China's announcements, plans for the so-called New Silk Road, or they call it a new economic corridor. They're looking to build huge transport, logistics, infrastructure networks between China and the emerging world. Just a couple of days ago, China announced a $60 billion capital investment plan, including a huge plan to build a new economic corridor through Pakistan to the Arabian Sea. These are enormous, absolutely enormous plans. There's many barriers along the way, but this is a key feature of our globalizing world. And of course, I mentioned acquisitions. You don't have to turn very far in the newspapers to find examples of where Chinese companies are now buying up Western technology. So Geely buying the Swedish car firm Volvo, the Italian tire maker, the iconic tire maker Pirelli, to be bought by Chem China. There are many more examples along the way. And of course, globalization, for many of you, is the rise of the global brands. I love this graphic. This graphic suggests that the 10 kind of leading consumer-facing consumer goods and services companies have an incredible reach of the brands and the products that we consume. So from Kraft to Nestle to Procter & Gamble to Mars to Kellogg's, they literally satiate and swamp in many ways the retail malls with their products. And this is the idea that globalization may well have led to a loss of cultural diversity, the standardization of global brands. Foreign direct investment is important for the UK. Everybody in the exam mentions Nissan, which is okay, that's top left on this chart, one of the world's biggest car plants. But I'll just have one more example of foreign investment other than Nissan for your exam to demonstrate the advantages, for example, of FDI into the UK. The proposed Siemens plant in Hull at the bottom right there, the Cummins power generation plant in Ramsgate. There are many examples one could find. The Akzo Nobel plant in Ashington in the northeast of England. Don't necessarily rely just on Nissan. So let me take you through what I think are some of the key benefits of globalization generally. We'll come to the issue about the UK in a second or two. I mean, the key here, I think, is to be able to match some good, solid theory, some good analysis with what you see happening in the world and your experiences. And there's no right or wrong answer to these kind of questions. To my mind, the fundamental benefit of globalization is that it allows consumers to benefit from what producers are doing. So the greater specialization, the greater division of labor, scale economies, in theory, should bring about consumer welfare gains. And if globalization, that's a big if it leads to more competitive markets, then again, in theory, that should bring down the rate of supernormal profit of monopoly producers. And also incentivize businesses to be more dynamically efficient and to kind of seek some cost reducing process innovations in markets. Again, consumers stand to benefit there because if profits are lower and prices are lower, then real incomes go up and the amount of consumer surplus enjoyed also rises. And if globalization leads to stronger growth of real GDP in the world, and keep in mind that the world economy grows at between 3 and 4% per year, and if that leads to faster growth with a given level of population growth, that should help to lift per capita incomes and therefore bring down extreme poverty and achieve some of the Millennium Development Goals. My own view is that the free movement of labour is a positive, it's a benefit to many, many countries. And globalisation, if it involves a greater degree of geographical mobility of labour, is another benefit. And one can argue in a slightly non-economic way that as people travel more and experience more of the world around them, students on gap years, people on sabbaticals, people travelling the world for business as well as for leisure, then they become much more aware of the global issues and the global challenges, ranging from inequality to climate change to democracy. I think that awareness is something which 15, 20 years ago really wasn't on the same level. What's I think really interesting from a sort of microeconomic point of view is that globalization is, in a sense, fast forwarding the disruptive aspects of new technology. I love this quote. It came from an analysis of creative destruction. I think it was from The Economist a few weeks back. If you take 4 of these companies, Uber has become pretty much the world's biggest taxi company. It doesn't own a single vehicle. Facebook is a huge media company. It doesn't create any content. Alibaba has become the world's biggest retailer, bigger than Walmart. It doesn't have any stock. And Airbnb in sort of stock market terms is probably worth more than Intercontinental Hotels or Hilton Hotels. It doesn't own any rooms. So globalization, in a sense, provides a platform and an opportunity for new companies to emerge and for these businesses to scale up at a speed which is unprecedented. Just a few bits of pieces in terms of the wider benefits of globalization. My own view is that globalization has helped significantly to bring down extreme poverty. There are many, many fewer people living in extreme poverty. That's less than $1.25 per day PPP. But obviously progress in sub-Saharan Africa has been smaller. The number of people in sub-Saharan Africa who are in extreme poverty has gone up. And that's largely on account of rapid population growth. But poverty rates are falling, albeit too slowly in many cases. Child mortality has fallen. This chart's taken from the World Bank. And again, although sub-Saharan Africa is significantly well ahead, progress is being made in reducing the rate of child mortality. Of course, that's one of the key Millennium Development Goals. That said, we still have countries where the majority of the world's extreme poor live in only a few nations. So one can see here that the population living in extreme poverty has halved since 1990. But 2/3 of the world's extremely poor live in just these 5 countries: India, China, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and the DRC. And of course, all kind of issues we mentioned, the awareness of issues such as malnutrition, extreme hunger. Each year we get the data published on the Global Hunger Index. And I'm just giving you this slide so you have a little bit of awareness of which countries, sadly, figure right at the top of this list in terms of the percentage of the population who are measured as undernourished or underweight. Burundi and Eritrea significantly above the world average and the average of some of the least performing countries. What about the disadvantages of globalization? Globalization is one of those topics that raises many, many different opinions, and it's pretty hard to avoid making value judgments. I'll do my best, but can I try and pick out a few broad examples of disadvantages? One is the issue of whether globalization, whilst lifting per capita incomes and reducing extreme poverty, might also be a factor, a catalyst behind increasing inequality of income and wealth within countries. I think it's one of the paradoxes of globalization, that globalization has reduced inequality between countries, but may well have increased it within nations. A second disadvantage relates firmly on the environmental aspect. We see as world output and world trade increases, we see some of the consequences for carbon emissions, for loss of biodiversity, for increasing water scarcity, and the loss of natural capital, which clearly is a threat to the global commons. And the third point I want to make is that globalization, which I've defined as a more interconnected, interdependent world, whilst that can help make countries more resilient, because, for example, they might be trading with many more countries, actually it's a process which could make countries more fragile. The key words here, which I've underlined in red, are systemic risk. Events in one part of the world can have a reverberation effect thousands of miles away. So an external shock, a fall in the price of oil, a collapse in the price of iron ore, or stock market volatility in one country, they can have significant externality effects which bring about systemic risk. The evidence is pretty strong that financial cycles, changes in asset prices, exchange rates, and credit, those cycles are more volatile than real cycles, cycles of output and jobs and investment. There's very, very strong interconnections between them. I'll come back to that in a second. Trade imbalances are also an important disadvantage of globalization. Increasingly, we see in the world the rise of mega surplus countries, countries running current account surpluses in excess of 10% of GDP. Two examples there would be countries such as Singapore and Norway, huge surplus countries. Until recently, Saudi Arabia would be there until the price of oil collapsed. And yet we also have countries running enormous trade current account deficits of more than 8 to 10% of GDP, including many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana. So trade imbalances are becoming a feature of globalization. And with those come calls and political pressure for tariffs and quotas and other forms of protectionism, and also increasingly countries avoiding using free floating exchange rates and deciding to move to more managed exchange rate systems. Many countries, although incomes have gone up, although GDP has gone up, structural problems have emerged. Manufacturing has shifted to lower labour cost nations. Other industries have declined, and that leads to structural unemployment, a major cause of labour market failure, and a big policy issue. And there's the issue about global diversity, cultural diversity. Are global brands dominating the landscape in too many countries? Are we losing out on the smaller businesses, the bespoke businesses, and the products they produce? Here's a few more charts on globalization, most of which I think relate really to inequality. And according to the Gallup, the richest 3% in the world hold a fifth of all the income in the world. And indeed, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, the richest 2% of residents hold 20% of the income, whereas 63% of the population only have 20% of the income. There's a huge gap between rich and poor. The rise of the super rich. This is taken from a survey by the management consulting company Bain, and it looks at the spending of the super rich and how they spend their money on luxury cars, luxury consumer goods, luxury hotels, jets and yachts. Incredible numbers. A survey came out last year, a very well-known survey from Oxfam, which said that the richest 80 people in the world, they could actually fit into a London double-decker bus. they actually own more wealth than the poorest 50% of people on the planet. Again, evidence of the gap, the chasm in wealth between rich and poor. And here's the chart I was trying to find a few seconds ago, which shows the economic cycle in red, so-called business cycle, real GDP, and financial cycles. Notice that those financial cycles seem to be getting more volatile, and they're certainly more volatile than real cycles. This is a major threat to the world economy. One of the key words I would be using if I was revising globalization and writing about it would be this word imbalance. What we're seeing happen with globalization is growing imbalances. Now there's two types. One is an imbalance between countries, a trade deficit, for example. So Norway running a 10% current account surplus, whereas the UK is running a 5% deficit. We see big imbalances in foreign investment between countries. Some countries are awash with FDI, others struggle to attract anything like a significant capital inflow. And we see huge imbalances between countries in access to basic merit goods and basic public goods, such as a decent education and an affordable healthcare system. And then we also have imbalances within countries. So the debate about inequality within the United States and the Occupy movement is an example of that. If you take the UK, there's huge differences in unemployment rates across regions. High unemployment in the northwest, the northeast, and also in London, much lower unemployment in some of the southern counties of the UK. In countries such as China, the gap between rural and urban areas is also a major political issue. Globalization could well be leading to bigger imbalances, and those imbalances are a threat to the globalization process. The UK as a whole is pretty competitive. I'll leave this slide up for a few seconds. It's one of my sort of country profile slides that I produce. I will put some of these more on the website. UK globally, if you look at the middle column here, go 2/3 of the way down. Britain is ranked 9th globally in terms of competitiveness. So also ranked pretty highly in terms of corruption perception. We have a pretty transparent economy. So Britain is fairly competitive in the world economy, and that's a really good indicator to use. And it leads us into a discussion about whether globalization has been good or bad for the UK over the years. So does Britain benefit from globalization? Well, I suppose the quirky answer is it doesn't matter. It can't avoid it. We're an open economy. We're open to trade. We're open to investment. And unless certain parties get elected, we're open to the free flow of labour and capital. So Britain, by and large, in the long term, benefits from the trade creation effects of membership of the European Union and wider participation in international markets. It allows consumers ultimately to benefit from the exploitation of comparative advantage. The idea you can import cheaper products and new technologies. And exporters benefit from access to overseas markets as an injection of demand into the circular flow, allowing them to achieve economies of scale. Globalization makes our markets more competitive. To use a micro term, it makes them more contestable. In theory, that brings prices down and should drive unit costs lower. I argue that Britain benefits fundamentally from a freer flow of labour. There is a global battle for talent, for the really highly skilled, highly motivated people. And Britain does pretty well in attracting those, but that battle is going to get harder in the years to come. And even despite globalization, despite the fact that many people have lost their jobs in traditional industries, unemployment in the UK has been falling. It's now well below 6%. And for businesses, globalization provides huge opportunities for investment. Lots of British businesses export overseas and invest overseas. And Britain is also a major attractive venue for FDI, which is ultimately a source of jobs and capital, especially helping our balance of payments. On the other side, though, there are some risks. There are some costs from globalization. It's impossible to ignore them. And many people have a sort of tension when they think about what globalization is doing to their lives. There is a danger that globalization can lead to higher structural unemployment and more low-paid jobs. I talked a few minutes ago about the hollowing out process. We've lost a lot of manufacturing jobs, particularly to lower labour cost countries in Eastern Europe and in the Asian continent. And so we get a hollowing out effect. We're left with many low-skilled jobs, particularly in the service sector, that offer well below average pay, oftentimes close to the minimum wage. And yet we also have a rising number of very highly paid jobs, but to which not everybody is able to get those kind of jobs. Britain benefits from globalization because the world economy is growing, but we are becoming more exposed to those external economic shocks. And interdependence and fragile supply chains can make the world a pretty tough place to do business, particularly when you get a global financial crisis. Globalization could be leading to inequality, particularly the downward drift of real incomes for people on below median incomes. And we can't avoid the environmental concerns from rapid growth, carbon emissions, global warming, and also more recently, the rise of global public bads, health scares, the risk of pandemics, what have you, and the rise of global terrorism. And globalization may well have led to increased imbalances within the UK. It's probably lifted per capita incomes, but we know there are major regional variations in wealth and in jobs. This is a chart just shows the effect on unemployment, shows the fact here that the pattern of jobs has changed. So if you follow where the UK is, there's been a loss of middle skill jobs, which is the middle blue, a slightly darker shade of blue in this diagram. So there's been a significant loss of middle skill jobs, secretaries, people working in machinery and heavy engineering. Technology and globalization have both contributed to this. And yet the share of lower skilled jobs has gone up, and the share of managerial jobs, high knowledge, high skilled jobs has also risen. So one of the key features here is that globalization is changing the pattern of employment. And the idea that you will have one job in your life is now redundant. You probably have to prepare yourself for 6 or 7 different jobs during a working life. This has been a revision podcast, a revision webcast on aspects of globalization. And I hope you found some of the ideas and some of the content and some of the examples useful. Please keep the conversation going if you want. I'm on Twitter. And keep an eye on the website for news of future revision webinars. But for now, thank you for joining me, and see you later.